In the heart of ancient Rome, where marble arches gleamed in the sun and senators' voices carried through the forum, another spectacle unfolded that the city preferred not to parade in its triumphal processions. Beneath the grandeur of temples and aqueducts was the silent hum of an economy built on flesh. The slave markets, bustling and ordinary to Roman eyes, were the arteries through which human lives were bought, sold, and reshaped into instruments of service. Among the cattle grain and bronze, one commodity carried a value so steep it provoked satire and disgust, even from Roman writers themselves: boys. These markets were not tucked away in dark alleys. They stood openly, part of the city's daily rhythm. The Forum Boarium near the Tiber River was one of the best known. Traders led in lines of enslaved individuals, Greeks taken from collapsing city-states, Syrians uprooted in imperial campaigns, Thracians seized on the frontier, Phrygians sold by desperate families. Each was placed on a platform with placards around their necks, listing age, origin, and qualities. For children, the cards spoke not of strength or craft, but of softness, refinement, and beauty, words that betrayed exactly how they were valued. Juvenal, the satirist, once remarked with bitter irony that a curly-haired boy could cost more than a farm. His words cut at the hypocrisy of a society that proclaimed simplicity and virtue in public, but funneled unimaginable wealth into private indulgence. For elite Romans, boys were not bought for toil in fields or mines. They were ornaments, delicacies, possessions to be groomed and molded into, reflections of their master's sophistication. To purchase such a youth was to signal not only wealth, but also refinement, a mastery over elegance itself. The journey to that wooden auction block was often short and brutal. Some were spoils of war captured en masse when a province was subdued. Others were children of poverty-stricken families who, unable to pay debts or survive, another winter sold their sons into slavery with the faint hope they would at least be fed. The desperation of these families was the first crack in the chain of Roman grandeur. What the empire called commerce was at its root the arithmetic of despair. Once displayed, the boys were subject to the gaze of buyers who circled them as one might examine livestock. Teeth were checked for health posture, for grace skin, for blemishes. Even their silence or timidity was interpreted as a desirable trait, proof of malleability. The market was an assault on the senses, the shouting of traders, the bargaining over human futures, the mingling of sweat, oil, and dust. For those on the platform, the world shrank to the eyes of strangers, assessing them as goods. The Romans did not pretend these children were equals. They were called delicati, a term that dripped with both admiration and contempt. To be a delicatus was to be cherished like a fine vase paraded in luxury, but with the same rights as a vase none. The word itself carried layers: delicacy, refinement, fragility. All suggested beauty, to be displayed and consumed, never to be respected. For the boys themselves, the first moments in Rome were filled with fear, cloaked in incomprehension. Many did not speak Latin. The placards dangling from their necks rendered them mute, translating their value into cold metrics: height, age, hair, texture, voice. Buyers muttered in front of them, speculating about potential uses: household ornament, banquet server, intimate companion. The child understood only fragments enough to sense that his destiny was being bartered in the open air. And yet for Roman society, none of this was hidden or shameful. It was woven into the fabric of civic life. Senators passing the markets on their way to the curia, would not have flinched. Generals returning from campaigns knew that captured boys could fetch higher prices than livestock. Rome's greatness, the aqueducts, the roads, the grain fleets, was underwritten by this commerce. But its elegance, its patina of refinement leaned especially heavily on this darker trade, the cultivation of living ornaments who made elite households glitter with human decoration. To the crowd in the forum, the sale of a boy might have been just another transaction no different than grain measured or sheep herded. But to the boy himself, it was the collapse of an entire world. Behind him lay the memory of home, perhaps a father's calloused hands, or the voice of a mother sending him to fetch water. Ahead lay marble halls that would never feel like his own, and chains that might be invisible, but were no less binding. This was Rome's invisible market, not invisible because it was hidden, but because the Romans refused to see its cruelty. They clothed it in language of elegance, joked about it in poetry, justified it as part of empire. But for those whose names were erased, whose identities were reduced to placards, the market was a theatre of human erasure, performed in the full daylight of civilization. And it is here that the story begins with the paradox of a culture that celebrated law, virtue, and glory, while standing comfortably on the stage where children were sold like curiosities. The purchase was only the beginning. For a boy selected as a delicatus, the real transformation began after the hammer fell. His new master's household became both prison and stage, a place where his very being was shaped into a living ornament. If the slave market reduced him to numbers and traits, the elite household remade him into a performance grace, beauty and obedience embodied in flesh. To the Romans, refinement was not an accident. It was cultivated, trained, and enforced. A newly acquired boy might first be stripped, bathed, and anointed with oil, not out of kindness, but to erase the traces of his former life. His hair could be curled or perfumed, his skin rubbed with powders to highlight fairness or softness. Jewelry might be added, delicate earrings or bracelets signaling to guests that he was not a laborer, but a treasure. Clothing followed the same logic, light tunics of fine fabric that clung to the body, emphasizing youth and elegance, rather than offering protection. The training was relentless. Every gesture mattered. He was taught how to pour wine with graceful movements, how to walk softly across marble floors without sound, how to hold himself in a posture of attentive stillness while waiting for a command. His voice might be coached to soften its tone, his words carefully chosen to please. To stumble, to spill, to answer too quickly, these could earn punishment. His beauty was not enough. It had to be disciplined into service. Writers of the time leave us fragments that hint at how pervasive this culture was. Martial the epigrammatist wrote verses mocking the excess of noble households, where slaves were groomed to act as if they were fine art pieces rather than people. The satirical laughter concealed unease. The elite spent fortunes shaping their living ornaments, while pretending this reflected refinement. But behind the laughter was cruelty. The boy himself had no choice. His days blurred into ritual polish, serve, obey. For the master's possession of such a slave was a statement. To invite guests into a triclinium and have a boy serve wine was not simply about service. It was a demonstration of wealth so vast that it extended into the intimate sphere. These children became status symbols, as much a part of the decor as marble busts or golden cups. Juveniles jibe that a boy with curls cost more than a farm, was not an exaggeration. Prices soared because scarcity created allure. To have what others could not afford marked an elite household apart. But beneath the finery, the reality was control. Delicati were watched constantly. They slept in confined quarters, often near their masters, ready to be summoned. Their bodies were monitored for blemishes or scars, as damage could reduce their value. Discipline was harsh. Flogging or humiliation served as reminders that beneath the jewelry lay a slave. For the boy, every day became a balance between survival and display. To exist without drawing wrath, to shine just enough to please, but never enough to provoke envy. And yet paradoxically, some of these boys lived surrounded by luxury most free Romans never touched. They ate leftovers from elaborate banquets, richer food than many peasants saw in a lifetime. They walked through halls lined with frescoes, handled silver and glass, overheard poets and senators debating philosophy. But this luxury was hollow, for it was never theirs. To sleep on a golden couch while knowing you could be beaten for a misstep was to live in a gilded cage. The empire institutionalized this contradiction. Manuals of household management treated these children as part of the economy of luxury, no different than fine fabrics from the East or spices from India. They were an investment, their training intended to maximize the return of admiration and prestige. And when the boy aged, when the curls lost their shine or the body grew into manhood, the investment declined. The same households that once prized him might sell him on, discarding him like outdated furniture. In this sense, the life of a delicatus was not about survival of the body alone. It was survival of the image imposed upon him. He had to erase his former self, learn to inhabit the role written for him by others. His very humanity became performance, and performance became the condition of his survival. This was Rome's genius, and Rome's cruelty to turn even children into stages upon which power and wealth could perform themselves. And in the process to convince society that domination was refinement, that control was culture, that exploitation was civilization. Inside the homes of Rome's ruling class, life, for a delicatus, was not simply existence, it was theatre. From the moment a boy was purchased and placed within an elite household, his body and behavior became objects of scrutiny. His value lay not in who he was, but in how convincingly he could reflect the wealth, refinement, and authority of his master. Every gesture, every step, every glance was part of a carefully managed performance, one reinforced by an unyielding system of discipline and display. The day often began before dawn. While the master still slept on his couch, in a bedchamber decorated with mosaics and imported fabrics, the delicatus might already be washed, oiled, and dressed. Slaves of lesser status prepared the tools, combs of bone or bronze-scented oils from Syria, soft linens bleached with ash. The boy's hair was arranged in the fashionable curls that Juvenal mocked in his satire, a style that declared both refinement and fragility. His skin was kept smooth with pumice and depilatory pastes, for even a hint of stubble was considered a flaw. To the Romans, a delicatus was not meant to resemble an ordinary boy. He was to resemble an ornament, a polished thing. Once prepared, his duties shifted to the day's public face. If a banquet was scheduled, he might be summoned to stand near the master's couch, ready to pour wine into golden goblets. He did not pour like an ordinary servant, clumsy and brisk, but with grace. Arm extended, wrist curved elegantly. The act was less about function than spectacle. a silent message to the guests that this household had wealth enough to train a child into a vessel of beauty. When aristocrats debated politics or recited poetry, the delicatus stood at the edge of the circle, a reminder of the household's refinement. He might be asked to quote a line from Virgil, to sing a passage from Catullus, or to entertain with a rehearsed joke. Failure was not tolerated. The smallest slip, a dropped cup, a stammered verse, a faltering posture invited correction. Correction in Roman households was never gentle. Overseers carried rods, whips, or canes. A misstep might mean a blow delivered publicly, the sting serving as a warning to the boy and an entertainment to the guests. Punishment was not random. It was calculated to reinforce the hierarchy. Even pain became part of the performance, demonstrating the master's power to command absolute obedience. To watch a delicatus punished was to see discipline itself on display, as though cruelty could be dressed up as order and elegance. But the role of the delicatus extended beyond public occasions. In the master's private chamber, his tasks blurred further. He might attend during grooming hold, mirrors massage scented oils into the master's skin, or arrange garments. The boy became both tool and adornment. His proximity to the master symbolizing not intimacy but domination. To stand at the edge of a bedchamber was to remind all who entered that the master could command not only service, but also beauty, refinement, and control. What made this existence especially cruel was the contradiction between setting and reality. These boys lived among marble floors, frescoed walls, and silver tableware, yet they owned nothing. Not their names, not their choices, not even their gestures. They could eat the scraps of luxury, but they were not free to hunger. They could stand in rooms of learning, but they were not free to think. They embodied refinement for others while being stripped of their own humanity. Surveillance was constant. Older slaves, sometimes eunuchs, monitored the boys to ensure discipline. Every movement, every word was tracked. To laugh at the wrong moment, to look too long at a guest, to speak without being commanded. These were violations of the code. Even their silences were judged. A delicatus was expected to embody obedience and elegance, simultaneously a paradox that required endless vigilance. And yet their presence mattered enormously to Rome's elite. To seat a delicatus in the dining room was as much a statement as displaying Greek statues or Persian carpets. He was a living symbol of taste, wealth, and power. His beauty reassured guests that the household had resources to spare. His obedience reassured them that the master's authority reached every corner of his domain. He was servant, ornament, and message all at once. Writers of the time understood this contradiction, though they rarely condemned it. Satirists like Juvenal ridiculed the extravagance of elites who paid more for a curly-haired boy than for farmland. But their mockery was aimed less at compassion for the child and more at disgust for decadence. The delicatus remained an object in their texts, never a subject. His suffering was background noise in a society that normalized the conversion of flesh into luxury. The boy's daily life was thus a choreography of survival. Every smile rehearsed, every bow practiced, every verse memorized to avoid punishment. Over time, the mask became indistinguishable from the face. The child who once ran in a village field was replaced by an ornament trained to stand in silence. Rome's ideal of discipline, so loudly celebrated in its armies and laws, was perfected in miniature. Here in the quiet subjugation of a boy whose existence was both privilege and prison. To be a delicatus in Rome was to live in splendor, that was also a cage. He existed not as himself, but as reflection of wealth, of taste, of power. His body was a canvas for discipline, his presence a performance staged for others. In every banquet, in every whispered verse, in every blow of the whip that kept him compliant, the boy revealed a truth. Rome preferred to hide that behind marble columns and polished rhetoric. Its greatness was built on bodies trained to serve as living symbols. If the life of a delicatus in a senator's house was marked by constant display and discipline, then the stakes rose exponentially inside the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill. Here in the shadow of Rome's emperors, beauty and obedience were not just ornaments, they became instruments of state power. The palace was a world unto itself, where politics, spectacle, and cruelty intertwined, and where enslaved boys found themselves transformed into the emperor's most secret servants. The palace was vast, a labyrinth of halls, chambers, and gardens designed to project both luxury and authority. Gold leaf glittered on ceilings, frescoes depicted victories and gods, colonnades stretched toward the sky. But in those same halls, Spardanes, castrated boys, and young men moved silently carrying trays, adjusting garments, or attending in private rituals. They were both present and invisible, integral yet erased. Roman law technically forbade the practice that created them. The Lex Cornelia de Castratione, part of Rome's body of laws against mutilation, stated that castration was illegal, framed as an affront to nature and Roman ideals of masculinity. Yet, as with so many Roman laws, enforcement was selective. In ordinary society, the ban might hold weight, but in the homes of the elite, and especially in the emperor's court, the law bent until it broke. Influence and secrecy shielded these practices. A senator might whisper disapproval in public, condemning Eastern corruption. Yet, in private, he benefited from the very same contradictions. The Spardanes were not Roman inventions. The tradition of eunuchs came to Rome from the East Persia Asia Minor, and beyond, where court eunuchs were long employed as loyal servants. Roman writers frequently criticized these practices as unmanly, decadent, and contrary to Roman ideals of virility. They sneered at Eastern kings who surrounded themselves with effeminate attendants. And yet emperors and elites alike quietly adopted the custom. Why? Because eunuchs symbolized control in its purest form. A boy altered by castration could not grow into a rival. Patriarch could not father heirs, could not disrupt dynastic power. He was perpetually dependent, perpetually childlike, perpetually bound to his master. Historical evidence suggests that many of these boys were captives brought from Cappadocia, Parthia, or Phrygia regions, associated with supplying eunuchs to courts. Some were taken as prisoners of war, others sold by desperate families, still others mutilated by traffickers who knew they would fetch higher prices. The process itself was brutal, shrouded in secrecy. Roman medical texts rarely describe castration in detail, but silence often signals the unspoken reality of pain too horrific to articulate. Archaeological fragments, records of slave sales, household accounts, and occasional inscriptions hint at their presence but never grant them voice. Within the palace, these spadones served roles that required both trust and invisibility. They attended the emperor's private chambers, managed wardrobes and cosmetics, guarded entrances to women's quarters, and often acted as intermediaries in delicate affairs. Their altered bodies symbolized safety, no threat of seduction, no risk of rival heirs, and their presence reinforced the emperor's image of control. A ruler who could command even nature, halting the development of a body, demonstrated dominion not just over men, but over fate itself. Roman hypocrisy ran deep. Senators thundered in the forum about defending mos maiorum, the traditions of masculine virtue, while attending banquets where delicati and spadonies served wine. Writers like Tacitus derided the corruption of emperors who indulged in effeminate attendance, yet the practice persisted across reigns. Tiberius, Caligula, Nero each left rumors of indulgence and cruelty involving young attendants. Whether exaggerated by hostile historians or grounded in truth, the consistency of the reports reveals how closely these boys were tied to the empire's imagination of power. The contradiction was stark. Rome idealized the paterfamilias, the stern male head of household commanding discipline and fathering heirs. Yet, its most powerful men surrounded themselves with servants deliberately stripped of fatherhood. Masculinity was proclaimed in public, but undermined in private, a hypocrisy that Romans both recognized and ignored. The empire could conquer nations and legislate morality, but behind palace walls, it depended on a hidden class of mutilated youths to maintain its rituals of control. For the Spadones themselves, life was a paradox of proximity and powerlessness. They walked the halls where decisions of empire were made, but they had no say. They were dressed in fine fabrics, but owned nothing. They lived in marble chambers, but had no freedom to leave. Their altered bodies became symbols of loyalty and exclusivity, yet the price of that symbolism was their own humanity. In their silence, they embodied Rome's deepest contradiction. This was a culture that celebrated strength and liberty, yet built its greatest seat of power on the backs and the bodies of enslaved children who could never speak their own truth. Behind every spado in the imperial palace, behind every delicatus paraded in gilded halls, lay a story of violence. It was not hidden, not subtle. It was the foundation. Rome's elite did not merely own bodies, they remade them. Control was not just political or legal, it was surgical, intimate, and irreversible. Violence became the language of ownership and mutilation, its ultimate punctuation. The practice of castration, though rarely described in Roman sources, hovered like a ghost across the empire. The Lex Cornelia condemned it in theory, but in practice it lived in the shadows, carried out by traffickers, slave dealers, or complicit physicians. It was a procedure of silence. No manuals survive, no detailed accounts, yet its effects are clear in the traces left by historians, satirists, and hostile commentators. These absences themselves reveal something essential. Roman society accepted the results, but refused to put words to the act. By erasing the description, they erased the pain. The methods must have varied. Some boys were likely subjected to complete castration before puberty, a mutilation that froze their bodies in a kind of eternal adolescence. Smooth skin, high voices, and slight frames were prized qualities for those destined to serve in elite households or imperial chambers. Others may have undergone partial procedures to preserve certain physical traits. Whatever the exact methods, the outcome was always the same. A body marked permanently as property. A person stripped of potential future, rendered incapable of independence in the biological sense. The violence was more than physical. It was psychological, symbolic, and profoundly performative. A master who could order the mutilation of his servant demonstrated power not just over the individual, but over nature itself. Masculinity, the ability to father heirs to command in the household, to continue a lineage, was central to Roman identity. To To strip that from a boy was to proclaim absolute mastery. "You will never be a man," the act declared. "You will never be a rival. You will never belong to yourself." This philosophy of domination extended into daily life. Punishments for disobedience could be swift and brutal. Flogging, starvation, confinement in small cells. The violence was carefully calibrated, not always to kill, but to correct, to remind. Rome's elite understood that control had to be visible. The delicatus, or spardo, was not just owned. He was displayed as a living symbol of his master's power. The body bore the message, "This is what I can do. This is what I own." Writers like Martial and Juvenal mocked the excesses of Rome's wealthy, sneering at their obsession with delicati and eunuchs. Juvenal jeered that a curly-haired boy could cost more than farmland, exposing the absurdity of wealth spent on human ornaments. Yet even in satire, the violence remained background noise, acknowledged but normalized. It was too routine, too embedded in the system to inspire real outrage. The silence of Roman medical texts is particularly haunting. Doctors wrote endlessly about women's fertility, men's wounds and gladiators' injuries, but on castration they are mute. Was it shame, disgust, or deliberate omission to maintain the polite fiction that Rome was not like the effeminate East? Whatever the reason, the absence of description reinforces the hidden cruelty. The bodies of boys were altered, their futures severed, but their pain was erased from the written record. This silence did not mean ignorance. Everyone knew. Senators whispered, emperors indulged, poets hinted. The palace filled with attendants whose high voices and smooth faces spoke wordlessly of what had been done. The contradiction was so profound it became invisible. Rome celebrated its laws, its masculinity, its traditions of liberticide, while walking daily among boys whose very existence proved those ideals hollow. To understand the violence is to understand the empire itself. Conquest was not only about armies and provinces, it was about the intimate domination of bodies. The mutilation of a boy in Cappadocia, sold and remade to serve in Rome, was part of the same system that built aqueducts, roads, and monuments. Power expressed itself everywhere, from the battlefield to the banquet, from the Senate floor to the private chamber. And always the lesson was the same: Rome ruled by violence, and violence was the proof of rule. In the long catalogue of Rome's indulgences and brutalities, few stories reveal so much about power, control, and spectacle as that of Sporus. His name alone, preserved through hostile sources, has come down to us as a symbol of what it meant to be caught in the machinery of imperial excess. He was not the first delicatus to be taken into an emperor's orbit, and certainly not the last. But his fate encapsulates the paradox of Roman domination, absolute degradation masked as theatrical honor. The story begins with Nero, the emperor who ruled from 54 to 68 CE. Remembered for his love of performance, his extravagant spending, and his violent whims. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and other Roman historians tell us that Nero became fixated on a young slave boy named Sporus. What drew him to the youth, his appearance, his demeanor, his resemblance to someone lost, is unclear. What is clear is that Nero saw in Sporus not simply a servant, but a vessel for one of his most grotesque fantasies. According to Suetonius, in the 12 Caesars, Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated. The procedure was not to punish, but to transform. The emperor then dressed the boy in women's clothing, adorned him with jewelry, and renamed him Sabina, after Nero's deceased wife Poppaea Sabina, who had died under suspicious circumstances while pregnant. To the emperor, Sporus was not merely a boy, he was a replacement, a living prop in the theatre of imperial grief, desire, and power. The transformation did not end there. Nero staged a full-scale public wedding ceremony. Sporus was brought forth as the bride veiled and attended, while Nero played the groom. The emperor placed a dowry before him, exchanged vows, and held a banquet to celebrate the union. Sporus accompanied him in public, seated beside him, in chariots attending games and banquets, as though he were truly the Empress of Rome. Was this love? Ancient historians are skeptical. Cassius Dio describes it as mockery, a grotesque parody of marriage meant to shock Rome's sensibilities. Suetonius suggests it was obsession. Nero unable to let go of his dead wife, forcing the body of a boy to fill the absence. Tacitus, though less explicit, echoes the theme of theatricality. Nero was forever blurring the line between stage and throne, turning even the private agony of others into a performance for Rome. For Sporus, the reality must have been unbearable. His body had been mutilated, his identity overwritten, his every movement watched. He was not a man, not a woman, not even fully himself. He was an ornament for the emperor's grief, a symbol paraded through Rome as both bride and victim. What choice did he have? Survival meant compliance. Silence, endurance. The symbolism of this episode is difficult to miss. Rome prided itself on the paterfamilias, the father, as ruler of household and moral order. Yet the emperor, the symbolic father of the empire, staged a marriage that inverted every Roman value. Masculinity, family, law, religion, all were twisted into a spectacle of domination. By making Sporus his bride, Nero was not affirming love, but declaring power. I can take a boy remake. Him call him my wife and make the empire watch. The story did not end with Nero's death. After his suicide in 68 CE, Sporus passed into the custody of others. First Otho, who had briefly been married to Poppaea Sabina before Nero claimed her. Then later Vitellius, another short-lived emperor during the year of the 4 emperors. Each treated Sporus as both treasure and toy, a possession whose value lay not in his person, but in the shadow of Nero's scandal. Vitellius, according to Dio, even planned to use Sporus in a grotesque theatrical execution to dress him as the mythological maiden Proserpina and have him violated by a wild beast as part of a public show. That fate, mercifully or not, never came to pass. Faced with the prospect, Sporus is said to have taken his own life. In that act, he claimed the one thing Rome could not strip from him, the timing of his end. His silence, his absence, became his final resistance. Sporus's story survives not because Rome cared for him, but because Rome's critics cared about Nero. He appears in sources as a footnote. To the emperor's excess, a human casualty of imperial theatre. Yet, behind the anecdotes lies a truth too often overlooked. He was a boy stripped of future, forced into roles that mocked his humanity. His life illuminates the cruelty of a system where power was measured by the ability to turn bodies into symbols and suffering into spectacle. In the shadow of marble palaces, Sporus walked as an empress in name but a slave in truth. His story asks us to look beyond the grandeur of Rome and see the fragile, silenced lives that made its theatres of power possible. The tale of Sporus is unique in its detail, but he was not alone. Scattered through satire, rumour, and scandalous histories are the faint outlines of other boys who lived and died within the gilded cages of Rome's elite. Their names are largely lost, preserved only in passing phrases, puer delicatus spardo eunuch labels, that stripped them of individuality and reduced them to functions. These fragments form a haunting mosaic of hidden lives, each one a reminder that Sporus's tragedy was not an aberration, but part of a recurring pattern of exploitation. One of the most infamous clusters of stories centers on the Emperor Tiberius, who ruled from 14 to 37 CE. After withdrawing from Rome to the island of Capri, he surrounded himself with youths brought from across the empire. Roman historians, especially Suetonius and Tacitus, describe his villa as a place of excess, with boys compelled to serve in ways that blurred the boundaries between servant ornament and victim. Whether the stories were exaggerated by hostile sources is debated by modern scholars, but their consistency across texts suggests that at least some measure of abuse underpinned the gossip. Capri became synonymous with hidden indulgence marble walls, sheltering appetites too scandalous to parade in Rome itself. Beyond emperors, satirists like Juvenal and Martial sprinkle references to delicati in their verses. These boys appear as punchlines, emblems of effeminacy, or symbols of elite decadence. Martial jokes about patrons keeping curly-haired boys for show, mocking their extravagance. Juvenal sneers that the cost of such a boy could exceed that of a farm. Their words reveal not sympathy, but disdain for the masters who flaunted these luxuries. Yet, in mocking the elite, they inadvertently expose the silent presence of the exploited, the boys who had no voice in the satire written about them. Elite households across Rome and beyond cultivated these lives in secrecy. A senator might acquire a delicatus from the markets in the Forum Boarium, display him at dinner parties as part of the spectacle of wealth, then keep him confined to inner quarters when not in use. To be a delicatus was to be trained in refined manners, reciting lines of poetry, playing the lyre, arranging hair or garments for masters and mistresses. But behind the polish lay discipline, enforced through punishments, physical corrections, and unrelenting surveillance. The boy was never truly off stage. Some whispers come from court intrigue. Pliny the Younger hints at household scandals involving delicate boys kept by wealthy patrons. Inscriptions and graffiti occasionally mention household slaves by name, sometimes praising their beauty or hinting at their roles in intimate service. Archaeological fragments, tiny shoes, child-sized jewelry, small beds in slave quarters suggest the presence of youths who lived within spaces designed to erase their autonomy. Perhaps most striking is how invisible these boys remain in the legal and historical record. Roman law recognized them not as persons, but as property. Abuse, even when extreme, was rarely noted unless it intersected with political scandal. A delicatus beaten to death would merit no entry in the annals unless his master was famous. A boy sold into a senator's house might live for years in luxury surroundings, but leave behind no trace of existence except in the fleeting comment of a satirist mocking the senator's taste. And yet, despite the silence, patterns emerge. The repeated references to their presence across emperors, senators, and wealthy merchants confirm that delicati were not marginal. They were embedded in the social fabric of elite Rome. The secrecy of their treatment was not a sign of rarity, but of normalization. Everyone knew, few cared. The rumors of Capri, the sneers of Juvenal, the fragments in inscriptions all point to the same unsettling reality. Sporus was only the most famous example because Nero made a spectacle of him. Behind his story stood countless others. Boys who endured their roles in silence, serving meals, reciting verses, enduring the weight of being simultaneously invisible and indispensable. In their absence of voice lies the greatest indictment. They remind us that history often preserves the indulgence of the powerful but buries the humanity of the powerless. For every Sporus remembered, there were dozens erased their lives, reduced to shadows behind the marble facades of Rome's greatness. Step inside the marble halls of Rome's elite, and the paradox becomes immediately visible. Boys like the delicati were draped in silk, perfumed with imported oils, and positioned in spaces of immense visibility: banquet halls, gardens, theatres, even the imperial court itself. They were expected to catch the eyes of guests, to embody refinement, to serve as living ornaments that confirmed the wealth and sophistication of their masters. Yet, for all this exposure, they remained voiceless, unable to speak for themselves or assert any measure of autonomy. Their visibility was not empowerment, it was performance. Consider a dinner party in the house of a senator. Reclining guests would sip wine from silver cups, debate politics or poetry, and watch as delicati moved gracefully among them. The boy's hair would have been curled and perfumed, his tunic tailored to highlight his appearance. He might be asked to pour wine with a smile, sing a few verses from Virgil, or massage the shoulders of a guest. To the assembled company, he was both servant and entertainment, a sign of the host's refinement. But if he faltered, spilled wine missed a note, hesitated in obedience, the correction could be swift and brutal, administered not behind closed doors, but in full view of the same audience that had just admired him. This duality, display and discipline, was the core of his existence. He was paraded as a luxury object, but the constant reminders of his status as property ensured that his humanity never overshadowed his function. In literary sources, delicati are described less as people than as extensions of elite pride. When Juvenal mocks the senator who spends more on a boy than a farm, the satire does not dwell on the boy's fate, but on the senator's excess. The boy is not a character in the story, but a prop. The imperial court amplified this paradox to its extreme. In the Palatine Palace, delicati and eunuchs alike attended to emperors in rituals of daily life, helping them dress, bathing them, even accompanying them to public appearances. Their presence was highly visible, a signal of the emperor's control over every aspect of luxury and refinement. Yet these same figures left behind no testimony, no accounts of their experiences. Their silence is deafening. They were displayed before the world, but erased from its memory, their lives curated by others who had the power to describe them or discard them. The voicelessness was not merely personal, it was systemic. Roman law had no framework to recognize the bodily autonomy of slaves, let alone enslaved children groomed for display. If a boy was beaten, raped, or mutilated, it was not a crime against him, but a matter of property damage to be handled or ignored at the discretion of his owner. His suffering did not enter the legal record. His words could not be heard in court. His body might be publicly admired, but his voice was institutionally silenced. Archaeology provides a haunting complement to this silence. In elite villas, excavations reveal slave quarters positioned just steps away from the lavish atriums and tricliniums where delicati were expected to perform. The proximity was deliberate. Slaves had to be ready at a moment's notice, their bodies always accessible. Yet, in these small, windowless rooms, traces of individuality appear: scratched graffiti of names, crude drawings, or tally marks, perhaps counting days. They are tiny rebellions, faint whispers in stone, the closest thing we have to the boys' own voices. The paradox of high visibility and voicelessness also carried symbolic weight for Roman society. These boys were not just ornaments of wealth, they were embodiments of control. By placing a child in silk and gold, yet denying him personhood, the elite demonstrated their power to define reality itself. They could turn a human being into a luxury object and compel everyone to admire him as such. The spectacle was not only about beauty, but about domination disguised as refinement. This dynamic endures as one of the most disturbing legacies of Rome's social order. The delicati were everywhere in poems, in satire, in gossip about emperors and senators, yet they never appear in history as subjects of their own stories. They lived in the spotlight, but were denied the right to cast their own shadow. They remind us that sometimes the most visible figures are the most silenced, and that greatness, built on such contradictions, is not greatness at all, but performance over humanity. Rome proclaimed itself the paragon of masculine virtue. Statues of hardened generals, triumphal arches, celebrating victories, and treatises extolling discipline and self-mastery were everywhere. The paterfamilias, the father of the household, was upheld as the model. Stern, controlled, authoritative, a man whose self-restraint mirrored Rome's supposed destiny to rule the world. Philosophers praised temperance. Orators celebrated the masculine ideal. The law itself was framed to protect the honor of freeborn boys and the dignity of Roman men. Yet the very same culture that condemned effeminacy and preached moderation built a hidden economy on the exploitation of enslaved children, especially delicati boys, bought, trained, and displayed for elite pleasure. This was Rome's deepest contradiction, preaching one ideal while normalizing its opposite. The Roman legal system illustrates the split with chilling clarity. Take the Lex Scantinia, a statute from the late Republic. It criminalized sexual relations between adult men and freeborn boys, reflecting a cultural anxiety about protecting the masculinity of citizens. To corrupt a citizen's son was framed as an attack on family honor and on the Republic itself. Yet that protection extended only to the privileged. Enslaved boys, whether Greek captives, Thracian farm sons, or provincials sold by desperate families, had no such safeguard. The same act that was criminal if inflicted on a citizen's child was perfectly legal, even celebrated when done to a slave. Law, in other words, shielded status, not innocence. Masculinity was defended only for those born with the right lineage. Others were condemned to be its foil. Writers of the age noticed the hypocrisy. Juvenal, in his biting satires, mocked senators who railed against Greek softness, yet filled their houses with delicate slaves imported from Asia Minor. Martial teased noblemen who performed speeches on Roman virtue, while secretly dressing their boy slaves in silks. Satire became both mirror and mask. It revealed elite indulgence, but also normalized it by turning it into comedy. A senator might blush at juveniles' barbs, but he rarely changed his behavior. Instead, laughter itself became a kind of safety valve, allowing Roman society to acknowledge its contradictions without addressing them. This hypocrisy was not confined to private homes. At the very heart of power, the imperial palace, the contradiction was institutionalized. Emperors like Nero employed eunuchs even as Roman moralists denounced castration as an Eastern vice. Officially, Roman law, under the Lex Cornelia, forbade the practice associating it with foreign decadence. Unofficially, the palace adopted it eagerly, crafting boys into spadones, who embodied obedience, pliancy, and permanence as servants. Rome scorned Oriental effeminacy in rhetoric, while quietly relying on it for the functioning of its court. The contradiction was not a flaw. It was a deliberate double standard that allowed the empire to enjoy both the image of virility and the utility of exploitation. Philosophers amplified the dissonance. Seneca wrote endlessly on self-control, warning against luxury and urging men to resist temptation. Musonius Rufus insisted that true masculinity meant mastery over desire. Yet, these same admonitions often ignored the reality that elite men surrounded themselves with delicati, whose very existence as ornaments of pleasure was a cultivated form of temptation. It is telling that Stoic philosophy rarely condemned the practice outright. The silence reveals how normalized it had become. The contradiction was not just in practice, but in thought itself, a blindness to the enslaved body as a moral subject. For the boys caught inside this system, the contradiction defined their lives. They were forced to perform effeminacy in households that publicly derided it to sing dance and groom masters, while knowing that their very existence was framed as a corruption. They were made into spectacles of luxury, while the society around them claimed to despise softness and excess. They lived as living paradoxes, objects of scorn and desire, at the same time condemned by the ideals of the culture, but essential to its functioning. This hypocrisy reveals something fundamental about Rome. The empire's greatness rested on a carefully maintained split between what it claimed to value and what it actually consumed. Masculinity was an ideal for citizens. Effeminacy was imposed on slaves. Self-control was preached in philosophy, while indulgence reigned in practice. Law thundered about dignity, while leaving entire populations outside its protections. Rome managed to hold both sides at once, admiring itself as virtuous, while reveling in the luxuries that virtue supposedly rejected. In the end, the contradiction was not an accident of hypocrisy, but the very mechanism by which the system functioned. By defining some bodies as worthy of honor and others as expendable, Rome preserved its image of masculine discipline while exploiting those it had stripped of rights. The delicati forced to embody what Rome condemned became symbols of this cultural doublethink. Their existence forces us to ask, was Rome truly the champion of discipline and virtue it proclaimed? Or was its greatness built on a lie? It told itself a performance of masculinity that relied in secret on the suffering of boys. Behind the marble facades of Rome, the trade in delicati was not just a matter of desire or cruelty. It was economics as calculated and deliberate as the grain supply or the taxation of provinces. Enslaved boys were part of what we might call the luxury economy, a tier of commerce that catered to the appetites of the wealthy and powerful. To understand how they were treated, one must follow the trail of money markets and conquest that made their existence possible. The Forum Boarium near the Tiber was one of the central slave markets of Rome. Here, merchants displayed their human wares as openly as cattle or mules, and placards described the attributes of each body for sale: the age, the origin, the physical build, sometimes even the softness of skin or curl of hair, were recorded not unlike the way a dealer might describe the weight or lineage of livestock. The most desirable boys came from regions associated with refinement and beauty: Greeks, Phrygians, Syrians, Thracians. Their foreignness was exoticized, their accents and features treated as luxuries to be purchased. The prices reflected this demand. Juvenal sneered that a curly-haired boy costs more than a farm, and this was not hyperbole. A healthy agricultural estate in Italy might cost 100,000 sesterces. A particularly handsome delicatus could fetch a price nearly as high. Such sums were not only indicators of elite indulgence, they were displays of status. To own such a boy was to declare wealth as loudly as one's villa, one's retinue of clients, or one's silver tableware. In Rome's social theatre, bodies were investments as well as ornaments. The supply of these boys followed the map of Roman conquest. Each war, each annexation, each punitive raid produced captives. After Pompey's campaigns in the east, for instance, the markets flooded with Syrian and Cappadocian youths. Julius Caesar's Gallic wars brought in thousands of prisoners, though most Gauls were sent to labor in fields or mines. For delicati, however, the pipeline was selective. Families in the provinces crushed by taxes or debts sometimes sold their sons voluntarily into Roman hands. For a struggling peasant, the price of a child could mean survival for the rest of the family. Others were taken outright spoils of war transformed into commodities. Once purchased, the economic calculation did not end. The maintenance of a delicatus was costly specialized training in music poetry grooming, fine clothes to enhance appearance, careful diets to preserve youthful proportions. Masters invested in these boys, as one would invest in horses or exotic animals, expecting them to yield returns in prestige and pleasure. Some households even commissioned medical attention not to heal them fully, but to maintain their desirable features. If a boy grew too quickly or developed muscular bulk, he might be neglected or discarded, his value depreciated like a broken ornament. This commodification reveals a deeper truth. Refinement in Rome was always tied to exploitation. The very concept of luxury, the banquets, the mosaics, the scented oils, was inseparable from the bodies of those forced to produce or embody it. Just as silk came from distant lands and spices from conquered provinces, so too did the delicatus arrive as a trophy of commerce and empire. Their elegance was not an accident of culture, but a byproduct of conquest, marketed and monetized in the heart of the capital. Critics occasionally noted the grotesque inversion of values. What did it say about Rome? Juvenal asked that men who praised the old simplicity of Cincinnatus could spend fortunes on boys. Martial teased those who valued delicati more than wives, treating their household slaves as ornaments of greater worth than legitimate heirs. Yet, satire never threatened the system. The market continued, driven by the endless appetite of those who could pay. And so the economy of elegance reveals the machinery behind the contradiction. The greatness of Rome's elite identity was purchased not just with marble and conquest, but with the lives of children. Each boy sold, each family impoverished, each body displayed in silk and gold was part of an empire's account book. The numbers balanced, but the cost was incalculable. For the delicatus, life inside Rome's elite households was a paradox: gilded surfaces hiding chains, luxury entwined with servitude. To survive in such a world required not only endurance, but also strategies of adaptation, some conscious, others instinctive, all fraught with risk. These enslaved boys were not free to choose their fates, yet within the narrow confines of captivity, they developed subtle ways of negotiating power, preserving fragments of dignity, or at least prolonging their lives. One common strategy was cultivating favor. The delicatus existed not only as servant, but as ornament, a living reflection of his master's wealth and taste. To be pleasing through manners, elegance, or skill could mean better food, softer bedding, fewer punishments. Many boys were trained to recite verses, play instruments, or converse with wit at banquets. Success in these roles might elevate them from the dungeon-like slave quarters to more visible, less brutal service. In a society obsessed with appearances, invisibility was dangerous. To be noticed for refinement rather than disobedience could be a shield. Another survival tactic was mastering invisibility itself. Those who could fade into the background, anticipate commands before they were spoken, or make themselves useful without drawing attention, might avoid the lash, or worse, silence. Caution and observation became forms of armor. In the labyrinthine corridors of Rome's aristocratic villas, a wrong glance or misplaced word could doom a boy. To survive, some learned the art of reading moods, the twitch of a master's hand, the tone of a senator's laugh, the flicker of annoyance in a guest's eye. A delicatus who could predict and smooth over such dangers became invaluable. Others sought alignment with powerful patrons. In rare cases, a youth might catch the attention of a figure whose protection extended beyond the household. A senator, a wealthy widow, even an imperial officer might see in the boy an opportunity for patronage. Though still enslaved, such relationships sometimes provided an avenue toward manumission. Roman society allowed masters to free slaves and grant them limited rights as freedmen. For delicati, however, this was rare. Most were discarded once they aged beyond their value. Yet, the exceptions mattered. A handful who survived long enough to become freedmen sometimes entered the lower tiers of Roman society as scribes, attendants, or minor bureaucrats. These few examples reveal the fragile threads of hope some boys clung to. That service might one day end in a measure of autonomy. Still, survival came at profound cost. To cultivate favor often required surrendering any sense of personal boundary. To align with patrons meant accepting exploitation as currency. Even the act of invisibility eroded identity voices, quieted gestures, restrained childhood memories, buried. Historians rarely record resistance, not because it did not exist, but because the system erased it. Acts of quiet rebellion, a look of defiance, a whispered joke among fellow slaves, a refusal to break under humiliation were seldom preserved in sources. Yet such fragments, invisible in the record, likely formed the hidden texture of survival. Occasionally, there are glimpses. In legal records, scattered cases appear where delicati were implicated in conspiracies, accused of aiding assassinations or leaking secrets. Such moments suggest that some used their proximity to power as leverage, slipping scraps of information or acting as unseen hands in political drama. These flashes remind us that survival was not always passive. It could be subversive, calculated, and dangerous. But most did not escape anonymity. When their beauty faded, when the marks of adolescence gave way to adulthood, delicati were often sold again into harsher labor, into prostitution, or into oblivion in the mines. Few lived to old age with their stories intact. The system was designed to consume them, while young leaving behind no testimony, only silence. Their survival strategies, however, clever, rarely guaranteed freedom. At best, they bought time. And yet, time mattered. Each day survived was a small victory against a structure that measured lives as disposable. Each gesture of care between enslaved companions, each shared whisper of laughter, each night endured, was itself resistance to a world that sought to erase them. Survival was not triumph, but it was something, an act of endurance within Rome's relentless machine of exploitation. If the delicati themselves left no written words, others wrote about them, though not with sympathy. Satirists, poets, and moral philosophers of Rome filled their verses with references to these boys, often mocking their masters for indulgence, rather than condemning the cruelty of the system. The result is a strange mirror, a world where exploitation was acknowledged openly, yet rarely challenged on ethical grounds. Juvenal, the sharp-tongued satirist of the late 1st and early 2nd century CE, remains the most cited critic of elite vice. His lines cut with sarcasm. A curly-haired boy costs more than a farm. With this, he did not weep, for the boy sold, stripped, and displayed. Instead, he mocked the ridiculous extravagance of Rome's wealthy, who would rather spend fortunes on youthful flesh than on productive land. For Juvenal, the scandal lay not in the suffering of the enslaved, but in the erosion of old Roman values, the frugality, discipline, and simplicity he claimed once defined the Republic. His barbs exposed hypocrisy, but his silence about the humanity of the boys is deafening. Martial, the epigrammist of the Flavian age, spoke of delicati with biting wit too. His verses mention pueri delicati as household adornment symbols of luxury, soft and pampered. Some poems sneer at masters who fussed over their favourites more than their wives or legitimate heirs. But again, Martial's sting was aimed at the decadence of elite men, not the lives of enslaved children forced into roles they never chose. The boys appear in his work as props, objects of desire or ridicule, never as subjects with voices of their own. Philosophers also noticed. Seneca, the Stoic tutor of Nero, lamented the moral decay of his contemporaries, who surrounded themselves with delicate youths. He thundered against the corruption of body and soul, contrasting it with the austere virtues of philosophy. Yet, even Seneca, whose moral lens was sharper than most, did not attack the enslavement itself. His concern was for the moral health of the master, not the agony of the boy. The enslaved remained invisible in the hierarchy of ethical concern. This is the central paradox of the moralist's critique. Rome had voices who decried luxury excess and indulgence. They recognized that delicati embodied the empire's corruption of virtue. But in almost every case their sympathy bent toward Rome's decline, not the enslaved child's suffering. The boy was evidence not person, symptom not subject. His pain was the price of a moral lesson for readers who already possessed freedom. Even when historians like Suetonius recounted scandalous anecdotes, the whispers of Tiberius's villa on Capri, the theatrics of Nero with Sporus, they presented them as curiosities or moral warnings about tyrants, not as indictments of a system that commodified children. The delicati were tools for telling stories about bad emperors, not about systemic injustice. This silence matters. The boys' lives were acknowledged, described, even joked about, but their humanity was erased beneath layers of satire and critique aimed elsewhere. Their stories became instruments of elite self-reflection, never advocacy. The very authors who recorded their existence also ensured that the only surviving accounts reduced them to symbols of decadence. And yet these distorted mirrors still reveal truths. The very fact that Juvenal Martial and others wrote about delicati so freely proves how normalized the practice was. They did not need to explain what a delicatus was. Audiences already knew. They did not pause to justify why enslaved children were bought groomed or displayed. It was common knowledge, part of the fabric of Roman life. The laughter of satire depended on a shared acceptance of cruelty. The moralist's critique then becomes a haunting testimony. By failing to defend the boys by speaking only of elite vice, these authors show us how deeply woven exploitation was into Roman culture. The delicatus appears not as a victim, but as a stage prop, luxurious, fragile, mocked, envied. And in that very erasure, we glimpse the real brutality. A society that could see enslaved children every day, use them as rhetorical devices, and never imagine them as fully human. Roman law prided itself on being the most advanced in the world. Even today, modern legal systems echo its language, its categories of ownership, its principles of contract and obligation. Yet, beneath that reputation lies a startling reality. The law of Rome was not blind in the way we might hope. It was deliberately blind to the suffering of those it considered property. For delicati and other enslaved boys, the law was not protection, but an iron cage carefully constructed to favor the master at every turn. Take the Lex Cornelia de Sicaris et Beneficiis, the law that formally forbade castration. On paper, Rome declared the practice illegal, a crime against nature and social order. Yet, enforcement was notoriously inconsistent. Why? Because the law only mattered when applied to the powerless. For elite households, exceptions were made. Cases overlooked, reports ignored. Eunuchs appeared in imperial palaces. Spadones served. Senators and foreign captives arrived, mutilated all in plain sight of a law that supposedly forbade their existence. The contradiction reveals a chilling truth. Roman law was not a shield for the vulnerable, but a stage for elite convenience. The legal status of rape offers another window into this systemic blindness. Under Roman statutes, sexual assault was not defined as a violation of the individual. It was a violation of property. If a freeborn woman was raped, the harm was considered an offense against her father or husband, whose honor and ownership had been violated. If a slave was raped, even a child, there was no crime at all. The master could use his slaves as he wished. Others who violated a slave were guilty, not of harming the victim, but of damaging the master's property. The body of the enslaved boy simply did not exist as a legal subject. Even contracts reflected this imbalance. Sale records for delicati openly described their physical appearance, their delicacy, their youth, sometimes their castrated state. The boy was reduced to a ledger entry sold as one might sell ivory horses or silks. These documents, fragments of which survive on papyrus and wax tablets, were perfectly legal, notarized by scribes, validated by magistrates. The legal machinery of Rome did not merely tolerate exploitation, it codified it, ensuring that commerce in human lives was as routine as trade in grain. The aios vitae nescisc, the right of life and death, granted to the paterfamilias, further entrenched this cruelty. A Roman father could decide the fate of his household, including the children he enslaved or sold. There was no legal recourse for the child. The father's decision was final. For enslaved boys purchased into elite homes, this principle extended to their masters. Whipping, branding, mutilation, all were permissible forms of discipline under Roman law. The absence of protection was not a loophole. It was the system itself. Even when laws existed that seemed to acknowledge humanity, they were applied selectively. The Emperor Hadrian is said to have banned the killing of slaves without cause, a measure hailed as humanitarian. Yet, the language of the decree reveals its hollowness without cause, left infinite room for interpretation. Sexual use, castration, and beatings could all be justified as cause. The reform was less about protecting slaves and more about curbing masters' extremes that threatened social order. The boy remained voiceless, legally invisible, his suffering only relevant when it inconvenienced the state. The irony is sharp. Rome exalted the rule of law, presenting it as the foundation of civilization, the marker that distinguished them from barbarians. And yet, this legal system contained deliberate blind spot zones where exploitation flourished unchallenged. To be a delicatus was to live precisely in those blind spots, existing in a space where law saw the transaction, but not the person, the contract, but not the child, the violation, but not the victim. And so the grandeur of Roman law, carved into marble and taught in modern classrooms, carries with it a shadow. The same codes that shaped nations also embedded silence, erasure, and permission for cruelty. For every principle of justice, Rome proclaimed there was another principle that allowed a child to be bought, used, and discarded without consequence. The law's silence was not accidental. It was policy. When we look back at Rome's grandeur, the marble forums, the aqueducts, the legal codes, it's easy to forget who is missing from the record. The delicati, the eunuchs, the nameless boys, auctioned in markets and absorbed into elite households, left almost nothing behind. Their voices were never inscribed on bronze tablets or carved into triumphal arches. Their lives were mediated through satire rumor and hostile sources written by free men who mocked them as symbols of excess. This absence is not accidental. It is the deliberate silence of a system designed to erase the humanity of its victims. No delicatus wrote his memoirs. No freedman petition survives, describing the trauma of being purchased for ornament rather than labor. The records we have are the property contract's dry documents that list hair color, age, and price, reducing a child to the language of trade. Even the Roman historians who delighted in gossip and scandal rarely paused to imagine what life felt like inside the skin of these boys. When Tacitus or Suetonius mention them, it is as props in the theatre of imperial decadence. The delicatus becomes a metaphor for corruption, never a person in his own right. And yet silence is not the same as absence. Archaeology gives us fragments that whisper at the edges of the official narrative. In Pompeii, graffiti scrawled on a wall references a boy favored in a senator's household, praised for his beauty and mocked for his effeminacy. In Herculaneum, household inventories record the presence of spadines alongside furniture and silverware. On a fragment of papyrus from Oxyrhynchus, a scribe carefully noted the sale of a boy untouched delicate apt for service. His value expressed in denarii, these scraps of text scattered and incomplete are the closest we come to hearing the lives that Rome chose not to preserve. The silence itself is a form of evidence. It tells us how deeply normalized the exploitation was. Roman moralists wrote endless treatises on family duty and virtue, but they did not write about the inner lives of enslaved boys. Satirists like Martial and Juvenal mocked the masters for their extravagance, but never asked whether the boys themselves suffered. The absence of empathy was not a gap in imagination, it was a cultural decision. To recognize their pain would have required Rome to confront its own hypocrisy, to admit that its refined culture rested on systemic abuse. This silence endured across centuries. When Renaissance scholars rediscovered Roman texts, they celebrated the elegance of Latin poetry, the power of Roman law, the grandeur of imperial history. They did not linger on the delicati. When Victorian archaeologists uncovered graffiti or papyri with hints of sexual exploitation, they hid the evidence, labeling it obscene or irrelevant. Entire generations of scholarship perpetuated the same erasure that Rome had begun sanitizing the past to protect the idea of civilization as noble and heroic. Even today, textbooks on Roman slavery often focus on agricultural labor gladiators or household servants. The delicate, uncomfortable truth of boys groomed and displayed as luxury property remains marginal footnoted or left unspoken. This silence is not benign. It is the echo of ancient erasure carried forward into modern historiography. Every omission repeats the logic of Rome that some lives are too small, too shameful, or too inconvenient to record. But absence also challenges us. It forces us to read against the grain, to imagine lives from traces, to reconstruct humanity from the margins of hostile texts. It reminds us that history is not only what was written, but also what was deliberately unwritten. The silence of the delicati is a wound in the archive, a void that exposes the limits of what Rome wanted remembered. And perhaps that silence is their final testimony. The fact that we must dig, speculate, and confront our discomfort to glimpse them shows how thoroughly power sought to erase them, and how necessary it is to resist that erasure. For in their voicelessness lies a mirror. Every civilization that prizes its own image will leave behind victims it prefers not to remember. Rome's silence is not unique. It is a pattern we can recognize in other times, other systems, other silenced lives. The afterlives of silence demand that we ask whose voices are missing from our narratives today and who benefits from their absence. Rome still towers in our imagination. The Colosseum's arches, the aqueducts striding across valleys, the codices of law that inspired Europe. All these seem to testify to greatness. But greatness, when we look closer, casts a shadow. And inside that shadow lived the delicati, the spadones, the nameless children reduced to ornaments of power. Their lives largely unwritten remind us that civilization can refine cruelty as elegantly as it refines marble. The paradox is stark. Rome preached the values of masculinity, discipline, and civic virtue. The paterfamilias was extolled as the moral backbone of society, a man who controlled his household with rational self-mastery. Yet, the same society applauded masters who paraded delicate boys at banquets, who built reputations on the ownership of youth priced higher than farmland, who silenced the very people they exploited. Laws forbade effeminacy, but households cultivated it. Statues celebrated strength, but homes prized fragility. This was not contradiction by accident. It was hypocrisy, institutionalized, baked into the rituals of power. Every monument we admire carried these invisible costs. Juvenal's biting satire was not exaggeration, but exposure. Curly-haired boys truly were sold for fortunes, and their labor, whether sexual, domestic, or ornamental, funded elite refinement. Behind the polished Latin of Cicero's speeches and the measured cadences of Roman law was a silence thick with absence. The grandeur of Rome was not a clean inheritance. It was built in part on lives too broken to speak. And yet Rome's shadow does not end with Rome. The patterns echo. Modern empires too sanitize their greatness, celebrate their engineering feats, their art, their governance, while obscuring the human costs beneath. We can see it in child labor, hidden within global supply chains, in trafficked bodies, behind industries that trade in luxury, in marginalized voices, excluded from official narratives. Just as Rome displayed elegance while normalizing cruelty, so too do contemporary systems polish their surfaces while leaving suffering in the dark. What makes Rome's story so chilling is how ordinary it was. The delicatus was not seen as scandalous. He was a fixture, a commodity, a symbol of refinement. Masters did not think themselves cruel. They thought themselves civilized. That normalization is the real lesson. At what point does a society stop seeing exploitation as violence and start seeing it as culture tradition or necessity? Rome answered long ago, the line erodes quietly until cruelty feels like order. The shadow of Rome lingers, not just in ruins, but in the questions it forces us to ask. Can we call a civilization great if it refines domination into ritual? Can aqueducts and epics outweigh the silenced lives that made them possible? What does it mean to inherit a cultural legacy built on systemic erasure? These questions are not only about Rome, they are about us. We remember Rome's greatness because its stones still stand. We must also remember its shadows because the echoes still whisper. The delicati had no voice then, but in uncovering their silence, we give them one now. And perhaps in listening, we guard ourselves from repeating the pattern, admiring the marble, while ignoring the mortar made from human pain.